You've probably heard of the space race, but most of the story is never told. How it started, how it really ended, and who controlled it from behind the scenes. I'm Mez, and the story begins as the fires of World War II faded over the ruins of Berlin. A different kind of war was already beginning, a war fought in the shadows. The great powers weren't chasing gold or land, they were hunting minds. In a bold intelligence operation known as Operation Paperclip, America smuggled more than 1,600 German scientists out under the cover of darkness. But among those hundreds of scientists, one name stood above the rest, or rather, one engineer. You see, as World War II raged on and German cities crumbled under relentless Allied bombing, Werner von Braun emerged as the most brilliant mind the German military had recruited to shift the balance of power through an unprecedented weapon. That weapon, known as the V-2 rocket, was a technological revolution that rewrote the rules of warfare. It was the first man-made object ever launched vertically into the atmosphere, then plunging back down from space at a speed faster than sound itself, piercing the defenses of the world's most fortified cities like London and Paris with zero warning. In just 6 months, around 3,000 rockets of this type were fired. But behind this engineering marvel was a dark and devastating human cost. Thousands of prisoners were forced to work in the secret underground factories of Mittelwerk Dora, and many of them died producing this legendary weapon. And yet, despite that heavy moral weight, the Allies didn't hunt this engineer down as a war criminal. Instead, the great powers raced to quietly claim him as a priceless technological prize. He was secretly transferred to America, given a new identity, and handed a position at the US Army's Rocket Center, where he launched his first American project, the Redstone missile, the first long-range ballistic missile in US history. On the other side of the world, the Soviet Union didn't need to copy the American playbook entirely. While America was betting on imported mines, the Soviets had a homegrown secret weapon of their own, Sergei Korolev. The state placed him at the head of an ambitious program known as the R Project. And so Korolev got to work, developing the R-1 rocket, climbing through successes and failures for an entire decade. Then, in 1957, Korolev shocked the entire world. He successfully launched the R-7, not just as the first intercontinental ballistic missile armed with a nuclear warhead, but as the most powerful engine humanity had ever built at that point in time. Now you might be asking, what does any of this have to do with the space race? The truth is, everything we've just described is the very foundation the space race was built on. But to really understand it, we need to recognize something important. This race didn't start as a political rivalry. It started as a scientific one. Since the mid-20th century, scientists around the world had been talking about the possibility of placing satellites into Earth's orbit as a scientific project to study the atmosphere and the mysteries of space beyond it. And so in 1957, the International Geophysical Year, IGY, launched with those exact same goals, providing the scientific and organizational framework for putting satellites into orbit. And guess who fired the first test of their intercontinental ballistic missile that very same year? That's right, the Soviet Union. And this was no coincidence with the IGY, and no sudden new idea either. The Soviet space program had already been quietly founded 2 years earlier in 1955, with Sergei Korolev at the helm. Then on October 4, 1957, using the mighty R-7 rocket, the Soviet Union became the first to turn that idea into reality, launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite ever to orbit the Earth.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
A simple metal sphere, roughly the size of a yoga ball, carrying nothing but a radio transmitter. And yet, that was enough to announce the beginning of the space race, transforming what had been a scientific conversation into an all-out rivalry between two superpowers. The United States was stunned. Americans realized the Soviets had beaten them to space, and that a race for technological dominance had officially begun. Anyone who tuned their radio to 20.005 MHz could hear the satellite's signal live. And just like that, an obsession with rockets and space spread like wildfire. Young scientists, hobbyists, and even children, their main passion became building model rockets, following every piece of space news and dreaming out loud about trips to the moon. But 5 days after Sputnik 1's launch, the president acknowledged that discussions about launching a satellite had been underway for around 3 years within international scientific programs, and that the United States had been working on its own version. And he was right. On July 29, 1955, the White House had announced its intention to launch satellites by spring 1958 as part of the International Geophysical Year. That announcement pointed to a project called Vanguard, which had been in development for nearly 2 years. President Eisenhower appeared to have full confidence it would launch soon and outperform Sputnik. It was more advanced and small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. He even publicly stated that the Soviet satellite didn't worry him one bit. But the Soviet Union wasn't waiting around for America's response. After the resounding success of Sputnik 1, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev issued a clear order: deliver a new satellite before the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution on November 7th. The engineers had less than a month. A complex project called Object D was scrapped, replaced by a fast and simple design, but carrying an idea nobody had ever attempted: sending a living creature into space. The new satellite, Sputnik 2, was equipped to carry a small dog named Laika. The goal wasn't just a spectacle, it was an answer to a critical question: can a living being survive in space? On November 3, 1957, Laika was launched into orbit. Her heart rate spiked sharply at liftoff, but stabilized briefly after reaching space, providing the first evidence that living creatures could endure weightlessness. The success was short-lived. Due to a malfunction in the thermal control system, the temperature inside the capsule rose to lethal levels, and Laika survived only a few hours before she died. And yet, despite the heavy price, the results were enough to change everything. The experiment proved that life was possible in orbit and delivered vital data on heart rate, respiration, and adaptation to microgravity. The Soviets had now surpassed the United States by 2 steps. But this time, the United States would not stay silent. On December 6, 1957, came the true test of the Vanguard project. Journalists from around the world gathered at Cape Canaveral, and the event was broadcast live. The countdown began, the engines ignited, and the rocket rose a few feet, then suddenly lost thrust and exploded within seconds. In one moment, the showcase became a very public failure before the entire world, promptly mocked by the global press as Kaputnik and Flopnik. Remember von Braun? When he heard the news, the explosion wasn't just a failure to him, it was a clear signal that his moment had finally arrived. Within days, he received the green light. The Army formally handed the mission to his team, and von Braun wasn't starting from scratch. His team had secretly been working on a modified version of the Redstone missile, known as Jupiter-C. On the night of January 31, 1958, Explorer 1 launched from Cape Canaveral and successfully entered orbit. America had finally reached space, and the success was scientific too, as the data it transmitted led to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts. About 4 months after Explorer 1, the Soviets decided it was time to launch their large scientific satellite, Object D, later known as Sputnik 3, aiming to outpace the United States scientifically. It was roughly the size of a small car, weighed more than a ton, and was packed with around 12 scientific instruments. But it ran into data transmission problems and only stayed in orbit for 2 years, compared to 12 full years for America's Atlas I. It was arguably the first mission where clear flaws in Soviet technology were exposed. Meanwhile, the American government recognized that relying on the military or scattered projects wouldn't be enough to keep pace. These factors were among the primary drivers behind the formal establishment of NASA on July 29, 1958. Both sides now had a dedicated institution with one singular mission: win the race. But the United States didn't want to simply react. It sought a leap that would outpace the Soviets by several steps. And so the Pioneer program was born, with one clear target: the Moon. On October 11, 1958, Pioneer 1 launched and burned up in the atmosphere after just 48 hours. Then came Pioneer 2 with more advanced instruments, burned up after just 42 minutes. Then Pioneer 3, whose rocket failed to escape Earth's gravity entirely, burning up after 38 hours. 3 failed attempts in 3 months. Meanwhile, the Soviets never announced their missions unless they succeeded. But just 2 days before Pioneer 3, they had attempted their own lunar probe called Lunar E1, which failed when the rocket exploded 245 seconds after launch. Less than 2 weeks after Pioneer 3 on December 18, 1958, the United States pulled off a completely different kind of success. The target this time wasn't the moon, it was communication. The satellite SCORE was launched, the first dedicated communications satellite in history. On Christmas Eve, it broadcast a pre-recorded message in the voice of President Eisenhower, the first time a human voice was ever transmitted from space to Earth. On the other side, the Soviets were working obsessively toward one goal: landing on the moon. On January 2, 1959, Luna 1 launched. Though its primary objective was to impact the moon directly, a minor timing error caused it to miss, instead passing alongside the moon and becoming the first man-made object to fully escape Earth's gravity. On September 13th, Luna 2 hurtled at tremendous speed to strike the moon's surface, achieving the first human-made contact with another celestial body. Though the craft was completely destroyed on impact, the mission carried metal spheres engraved with Soviet emblems and flags, scattering them across the lunar dust as Moscow's declaration of victory in the race to arrive first. But the celebration barely had time to settle. On October 4, 1959, Luna 3 launched on a precisely calculated arc around the moon, and for the first time in human history, its cameras captured images of the moon's far side, the face no human eye had ever seen. And here's the wildest part of that success: the Soviets used American film. US intelligence agencies had been launching spy balloons over Soviet territory, some of which were recovered. Inside those balloons, the Soviets found rolls of Kodak film, which they secretly repurposed and placed aboard their lunar probe. And so the first photographs ever taken of the moon's hidden face were captured by a Soviet lens, on American film, salvaged from spy balloons. In 1960, the space race entered a period of relative quiet, a year full of failed attempts from both sides. But behind the scenes, a pivotal shift took place. Wernher von Braun officially transferred with his team to work under NASA. In parallel, America was laying the groundwork for its decisive response through Project Mercury, the first American manned spaceflight program with 3 core objectives: place a crewed vehicle in Earth's orbit, test the human capacity to function in space, and ensure the safe return of the crew. Since risking human lives was far too great a leap, a trial run came first. On January 31, 1961, a 3-year-old chimpanzee named Ham was placed into his seat for mission MR2. The Mercury Redstone rocket carried Ham to an altitude of 158 miles, where he was required to perform specific tasks to test the effects of weightlessness. Ham performed brilliantly, announcing to the world that von Braun's machines were ready for America's first human astronaut. Amid all this technical noise, one question hung silently in the air: who would be the first human in space? The wait wasn't long. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin launched aboard Vostok 1 to become the first human being to break the bonds of gravity. The Soviets didn't just claim the title of first human in space, they crushed American records entirely. While Ham's flight lasted just 16 minutes, Gagarin spent 1 hour and 48 minutes in Earth's orbit, covering a staggering 25,000 miles in a complete loop around the planet. The numbers spoke for themselves. America was still testing how to jump towards space and come back quickly, while the Soviets had already mastered orbiting the Earth. America didn't wait long. Less than a month after Gagarin, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard launched to become the first American and second human to touch the edge of space. But let's be honest, set against Gagarin's full orbit of the planet, Shepard's 15-minute flight looked like little more than a hop off the ground. After this moment, a new player entered the ring, President John F. Kennedy. In a historic address before Congress, he spoke the words that would define the century.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
To many, this wasn't ambition. It was political and engineering suicide. America at that moment had no adequate rocket, no suitable capsule, and no experience keeping humans in space for more than a few hours. Kennedy's words didn't stay as dreams for long. They immediately triggered an unprecedented financial explosion. Between 1960 and 1962, NASA's budget more than tripled, leaping from $500 million to nearly $2 billion. By 1962, American space spending exceeded twice that of the Soviet Union. But at the height of this momentum, America suffered a blow from within: the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. The man who made the promise was gone, but the promise itself lived on as a sacred obligation. By 1967, Project Apollo was officially underway, with von Braun's fearsome Saturn V as its engine. But the beginnings were not what NASA had hoped. In January of that year, during a routine ground training exercise for Apollo 1, a sudden fire broke out inside the capsule and within seconds suffocated 3 of America's finest astronauts. From that point forward, meticulous review of every bolt and wire became the absolute priority, and the march toward the moon proceeded in slow, carefully measured steps. The hard work began paying off, from Apollo 7, which proved the capsule was safe in Earth's orbit, to Apollo 8, which circled the moon for the first time, to Apollo 9, which tested the lunar module, to Apollo 10, which descended to within 15 kilometers of the lunar surface without landing. The final dress rehearsal. On July 16, 1969, Florida trembled as Saturn V lifted the dreams of humanity skyward. 3 days later, on July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin guided the Eagle down to the Sea of Tranquility. 6 hours of breathless anticipation later, Neil Armstrong placed his foot on the lunar dust and spoke his immortal words.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
While the 2 astronauts planted the American flag and spoke live with President Nixon in a broadcast watched by 600 million people, fate delivered its final blow to the Soviets. At that very same moment, their unmanned spacecraft Luna 15 crashed onto the moon's surface in a last-ditch attempt to steal the moment. The race was officially over. American missions kept coming. 5 more moon landings followed. But the fundamental question remains, why were the Soviets unable to keep up? The answer wasn't a shortage of money or courage. It lay in the death of Sergei Korolev. In January 1966, the chief designer entered a Moscow hospital for what was considered a routine surgery. But on the operating table, doctors discovered severe internal bleeding and cancerous tumors. On January 14, 1966, the engine of the Soviet program stopped beating. In just 3 years, the Soviet Union lost the triangle that had been driving the race, in a series of events that proved how the obsession with political propaganda could backfire catastrophically. This pattern wasn't new. Back in 1957, the political pressure to launch Sputnik 2 in time for the Bolshevik Revolution anniversary had contributed to Laika's death. But in 1967, the same scenario played out in a far more devastating way. This time, the obsession with celebration cost a human life. Despite engineers identifying 203 structural technical problems in the Soyuz 1 spacecraft before launch, the order was given to proceed. Vladimir Komarov was the primary pilot, with his close friend Yuri Gagarin as the backup. Komarov knew the craft was a death trap, but he refused to pull out because he knew that if he did, Gagarin would be forced to fly in his place. In orbit, everything fell apart. The solar panels failed and the guidance systems went down. Through extraordinary effort, Komarov managed to manually execute a re-entry maneuver to return to the atmosphere. But during descent, the fatal flaw appeared. The main parachute failed to open and the backup became tangled. The capsule slammed into the ground at 140 kilometers per hour and exploded. All that remained of Komarov were charred fragments, which he had reportedly requested be displayed in an open casket funeral, forcing the Soviet leadership to face the consequences of their negligence. The bitter irony is that Gagarin died less than a year later, on March 27, 1968, during a routine training flight. With his death, the Soviet program lost its face before the world. Despite all the losses and the sharp political tensions, the space race didn't end with a military victory. It ended with a rare moment of cooperation. In 1975, an American Apollo spacecraft docked in orbit with a Soviet Soyuz craft. For the first time, astronauts from both camps opened the hatches, met face-to-face, and exchanged greetings and gifts. It was a quiet declaration to the world. Space can be a place of cooperation, not just a theater of conflict. And you? What do you think? Do you believe space will stay peaceful? Or are we headed toward a war over the moon sooner than we think?